And it came to be in the 11th year, in the third of the month, or on the first of the new moon. It's like saying on the third moon, on the first of the new moon, that the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, and many commentators and people say this puts this sometime in May. I don't know how they get, I think, May 17th, 30 something BCE or whatever, but they come up with that. I think that goes back to Bishop Usher, and I don't know if that timeline would be considered accurate, but you'll find that in some commentaries. But let's just say it was on the modern calendar, it would have been sometime in the middle of the month of May, and it's about 1 month before the Babylonian armies make it to Jerusalem at this point. So there's a little historical background. Son of man, say to Pharaoh, sovereign of Mitzrayim, and to his crowd, to whom are you compared in your greatness? See Asher, or Asher, Assyria, Syria, whatever you want to call it, had already been conquered by the Babylonians 100 years before, a little more. That's verse 3. See, Asher was a cedar in Lebanon. Now we use trees as a metaphor here, and this happens a lot. Beautiful branches and forest shade, and of a high stature, and its top was among the thick foliage. The waters made him great. Now you could say the literal waters, because the inhabitants of Nineveh and Syria were the first ones to build a big aqueduct out of the mountains to send water down into Nineveh before the Romans ever picked up the idea. So are we talking about peoples or waters or both? Because they're right on the trade route. The waters made him great. The deep gave it height, with its rivers running around its planting, and sent their channels to all the trees of the field. So they're talking about an irrigated forest here, intentionally. Therefore its height was lifted up above the trees of the field, and its boughs were increased, and its branches became long because of the many waters as it sent them out. And the birds of heaven, now this is an important verse, made their nest in its boughs and under its branches. Okay. All the beasts of the field gave birth, and in its shadow all the great nations dwelt. So now let's look at an interesting verse in relation to this. Let's look at Matthew chapter 13, verse 32. Let's compare this, because so far the accusation here is Egypt in their minds. The Most High says they think they're the great nation like Asher, but we're going to see that Asher fell to the Babylonians. But look at this language. So we stop at verse 6. Again, I'll read verse 6. And all the birds of heaven made their nest in its boughs, and under its branches all the beasts of the field gave birth, and in its shadow all the great nations dwelt. We got that, right? Now, let's look at Matthew chapter 13, verse 32. Now, I can read it or someone else can. If Teresa wants to pick it up, if not, I'll read it.
Yeah, I got it. Just verse 32?
Well, it's going to be more, but yeah, let's look at verse 32 because of the language. We can look at 31, 32, and 33 of Matthew 13, which is an important chapter.
Okay. Verse 32, which indeed is less than all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is greater than the plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the heavens come and dwell in its branches.
Okay, now this is the mustard seed parable in this chapter. Well, there's several parables in this chapter. There's 2 parables of the sower, and there's this on the mustard seed, and the tree and the birds dwelling in it. So that becomes really sort of interesting if we're going to contrast the kingdom of Yah. For instance, Psalm 104 says, The birds of the heavens dwell beside them. They sing from between the branches. So we'd have to go look more at Psalms. We got Ezekiel 17, because this falls in our Ezekiel study. On the mountain heights of Israel, I planted it and shall bring forth branches. And bear fruit and become a big cedar. And under it shall dwell birds of every sort. In the shadow of its branches they dwell. So look at the contrast here. What do we got? We've got Egypt compared to Assyria, which is fallen. Assyria associated as a large kingdom under which all the nations dwell. And then we have them, but a cedar is a lot bigger tree, a huge tree. You know, some of them can grow quite large. The Assyrians were big and powerful, and the branches. And we've got Egypt, which probably the biggest trees in Egypt are date palms, but they live along the Nile, the waters. And then we've got this contrast in Matthew 13 regarding the kingdom of Yah, and the language is similar, and especially Ezekiel 17:23 sticks out of this. So is there any thoughts on that? Has anybody made connections? Because this is an interesting subject, because we have a contrast between an earthly kingdom and a heavenly kingdom. But is the mustard seed the heavenly kingdom, or is it an earthly kingdom, what Yeshua is talking about? What part of the kingdom of Yah? Because we got all kinds of birds in it. You could look at the interpretation there and say, wait a minute. And then, so this becomes right here a kind of a deep dive. So let's do more in Matthew 32. Look at verse 31, 30, 31, 32.
Give me a second. I closed out of Matthew. What chapter was it again?
I'm sorry, chapter 13. Start at verse 30.
30.
Yes, thanks.
And let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of the harvest, I say to the reapers, first gather the darnel and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my granary.
Okay, that ends. Now look at verse 31.
Another parable he put before them.
He switched parables there. Go ahead.
Saying, the rain of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is less than all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is greater than the plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the heavens shall come and dwell in its branches.
Okay, now, go ahead. You had another thought. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I didn't know if you wanted me to go on to 33.
Yeah, go ahead.
And in another parable he spoke to them, the rain of the heavens is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal until all was leavened.
Okay, so verse 30 ends one parable. And so we have 2 verses, 31 and 32 are very short parable. And then verse 33 starts another parable. All this related to the kingdom of heaven. What's the similarities between these kingdoms? Ezekiel's kingdom is talking about the Assyrian kingdom that was conquered and how large it was. And Pharaoh and Egypt thinking they are now the ruling power in the earth. And they, like Assyria, will be conquered by the Babylonians. That's kind of the gist of chapter 31. But then we contrast the trees. And of course, Egypt doesn't have cedars unless someone brought one there. They have date palms. But look at this. We've got large trees, big nations, a lot of power, and then we've got an insignificant seed that starts out small. So what are all these birds? Are they all clean birds? It doesn't say. Or unclean birds. It just says all the birds. So we can take some thoughts away from that. So
probably clean and unclean together.
I would say so. Now, how does that apply to the kingdom of Yah? Because you would have people in the earthly realm, in the natural kingdoms, clean and unclean, wouldn't you?
Yeah, because it talks about verse 30. About the darnel and about the wheat.
Yes. Now there's a connection there.
Mm-hmm.
So are the trees indicative of, let me spin it this way, of the heavenly kingdom appearing to be an earthly kingdom? Are we starting out with men's concept? Let's say the church system. Let's use that. Have either one of y'all, and it's been a long time for me, ever read or heard about Augustine of Hippo's right book or whatever called The City of God? Basically, to sum it up, City of God is about, remember, end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century, Augustine becomes a believer. His parents were, I think daddy was pagan, mama was Christian, but this is the rise of the state church system. And Augustine goes a long way into building what would become the Roman Catholic Church system. His theology and philosophy lay the groundwork. In fact, he's called the first Latin father. Now, that being said, what do we have, for instance, inside the Roman Catholic Church? Is you have maybe some real believers and some people that are going through the motions. Do you have a type of the kingdom of Yah there that hasn't not yet directly under the control of Messiah? Is it a false tree? We've got to, I think this imagery, at least to me, becomes very interesting when the language of verse 6 in Ezekiel 31 and Matthew 13 have a lot of similarities there. This prophecy of judgment here in Ezekiel, but this verse 6 is definitely referring to Assyria, which had fallen to the Babylonians 120 years before this prophecy. And then we have this idea of the birds dwelling in it. So I'm looking at the kingdoms of the world versus the kingdom of Yah, and Yah's kingdom doesn't start out and grow into a big tree, it's a small tree, but it has the same thing in it. So if we're bringing people from different beliefs and understandings, some of them still eating unclean into this kingdom, some of them still living unclean, and you get, later on from Matthew, what Yeshua said 275, 80, 90 years down the road, and you get Augustine with this idea of the church as the kingdom of God. How does that change the dynamics of the Bible and what we teach and what many of the churches teach? Was it people not ready to handle a real messianic kingdom, so he gave them what they could handle, even though it wasn't the best? Are we looking for the kingdom of Yah to start small and, get large, but it's not a big cedar. It's not based on say military power per se, but yet we have the second coming and the conquering of the forces of evil, which is done, though it's supernaturally, it's essentially a military power. Because I got something else to say on this that might kick in. Billy will grasp on it maybe, and I hope Teresa will. Well, here's my point. I want to move on in this, but there was a video about a telescope that's run by the University of Hawaii, but it's not in Hawaii. It's actually in Chile up on a mountain. And it's discovered a new interstellar, not or intergalactic, huge object that's going to be moving through our solar system from outside our solar system sometime in October. But the commentator said that this telescope was part of the planetary defense system called Atlas. Now, isn't that interesting? Have either one of you ever heard of a planetary defense system? How's a telescope, defensive? Is it a laser or what?
Yes, I've heard of it. The telescope identifies things that might be threatening the Earth. Period.
But what about how are we going to stop an object that's 20 miles wide? Or is this system in place because somebody in the echelons of power understand there's a potential for an interstellar invasion of the solar system? And who would the elites and the powers that be concerned about invading the planet Earth and getting a head start? We got telescopes, and remember last week in Shabbat I mentioned something about satellites that would have weaponry on board, even though technically there's treaties against that. And it wasn't just amusing, but certain things sort of keyed me to that. And I didn't hear about this until I was looking at that. That video popped up in my feed today. It wasn't long, but since it was space related, I thought that's interesting that they call this planetary defense system Atlas. Well, who's Atlas? He's one of the titans in Greek mythology. We had parked at verse 6. Let's go ahead and read on. And it was beautiful in greatness, verse 7, and in its length of its branches, for its roots reached to many waters. Revelations, many waters. Cedars in the garden of Elohim. There we go. We have a comparison of Egypt and Assyria here to the garden of Elohim. Did not hide it. Fir trees were not like its boughs, and the chestnut trees were not like its branches. No tree in the garden of Elohim was as pretty as it. Now, this goes back to what Billy just put on the chat. Who was the most beautiful being in the garden of Elohim, right? Who was the power that be? Verse 9, and I made it beautiful by its many branches, so that all the trees of Eden, which were in the garden of Elohim, were jealous of it. Therefore, verse 10, thus said the Master Yahweh, because you have increased in height, now we're getting back to Egypt, and set its top among the thick foliage, and its heart was lifted up in its height. That goes back to chapter 28, and whose heart was lifted up. Verse 11, I gave it into the hand of the mighty one of the nations, or the God of the nations. I give it into his hand. Wow. Billy, that seems to go along with your comment there. And he shall certainly deal with it, unless we're just talking about Nebuchadnezzar. But who's the power behind the power? That's the thing. I have driven it out for its wrong. And foreigners, the most ruthless, I can't talk, of the nations shall cut it down and leave it. Its branches shall fall in the mountains and in all the valleys. The bows lie broken by all the rivers of the land, and all the peoples of the earth shall come out from under its shadow and leave it. Are we talking about Egypt or Assyria? Well, I think we're talking about both, because the comparison is between the kingdom of Egypt and what was once Assyria. But the mighty one of the nations, verse 11, humanly speaking, is referring to Nebuchadnezzar, and he shall certainly deal with it. But who's maybe the power that's been put, that is trying to manipulate the situation? Billy brought that up in the chat. Verse 13 is going to go up and bring this language again that we saw in verse 6. On its ruin shall dwell all the birds of heaven, and all the beasts of the field shall be on its fallen branches, so that none of the trees by the waters would exalt themselves because of their height, nor set their tops among the thick foliage, and that no tree which drinks water would ever be high enough to reach up to them. For all of them shall be given to death, or Sheol, or hell, to the depths of the earth, among the children of men who go down into the pit. Thus said the Master Yahweh, in the day when I brought down to Sheol, I shall cause mourning. I shall cover the deep because of it hold back its streams, and many waters shall be confined. I shall make Lebanon mourn for it. Remember, that's the Philistine, not the Philistines, excuse me, the Carthaginians. I can't say the other name right now. And all the trees of the field shall wither away because of it. I shall make nations shake at the sound of its fall, when I shall bring it down to Sheol, together with those who descend into the pit. And all the trees of Eden. This is focusing really on the Middle East. So Lebanon there would be, and all that drink water shall be comforted in the depths of the earth. They too shall go down to Sheol with it. In other words, with those slain by the sword, and those who were in its strength shall dwell in the shadow among the nations. To whom are you to be compared in esteem and greatness among the trees in Eden? We keep going back to Eden here, which takes me right back to chapter 28 of Ezekiel. Who was in the Garden of Eden, you know? And that's talking about the king of Tyre. But then it gets to a point where, like Billy said in the comment, who is this guy that's not the king of Tyre? But you shall be brought down with the trees of Eden to the depths of the earth. Lie in the midst of the uncircumcised with those slain by the sword. This is Pharaoh and all his crowd. So the judgment here is on Pharaoh and Egypt and his armies, declares the Master Yahweh. That's not a very long chapter. So we're dealing with.
I think it also refers to the greater Egypt.
And I would agree. How does it refer to the greater Egypt? Considering trees.
Well, Hasatan, in the first place, continues to do what he did in the heavenlies, and that's to bring people against the Most High, in particular with humans, to cause humans to seek paganism instead of seeking the right faith. So he continues this, and as he continues this, the paganism of Egypt continues to grow and spread and grow and spread and cover the entire earth.
Yes.
I mean, in other words, Hasatan was considered to be the prettiest, greatest malach in the heavens until he fell, and then he becomes ugly. And all the things that he does produces ugly.
Yeah, because the whole focus of this is Assyria falling and being judged, then Egypt being like Assyria, but it focuses on this Garden of Eden language, birds in the trees. So if I contrast great cedars, great powers of men that fall with the kingdom of Yah, which starts out small and insignificant like a mustard seed and yet grows, it brings together the birds in its branches. So because the powers of the nations get cast down. What do you think about that? Or will be cast down, like you said.
Yep. It's always a current and a forward.
Yeah. But the language here connecting Matthew 13, like Teresa read, with trees and that stuff. And there's just 2 verses in all of Matthew 13 that deal with the mustard seed and the trees and the branches. But all the parables are different, but they're the same, having to do with the kingdom. And we're looking at Yah's kingdom versus the kingdom of men.